The memory of that morning is etched into my mind not by sight, but by the scent of roasted Arabica and ancient pine needles, the specific, holy stillness of 6 a.m. in the mountains that feels like nature holding its breath, a silence that I was currently sharing with Attorney General Sterling, the state's highest-ranking prosecutor, who was sitting on my hand-hewn porch swing, casually reviewing a $3 million federal grant proposal while balancing a plate of eggs Benedict on his knee. We were discussing the future of the valley, talking about legacy and preservation, when the silence was violently murdered by the aggressive, throat-clearing roar of a diesel engine, the sound of gravel being crushed under heavy, entitled tires, followed by the slamming of a door that echoed like a gunshot. A matte black Range Rover had parked directly on my prize-winning hydrangeas, behaving less like a vehicle and more like an occupying tank. Out stepped a woman who radiated the kind of manic, terrifying energy usually reserved for warlords or reality TV villains, her designer stilettos clicking against the timber of my steps with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to disaster, a camera already raised to her eye like a weapon as she marched toward us. She didn't notice the man in the suit, didn't notice the state seal on the documents he was holding. She only saw me, Elias Thorne, the 55-year-old retired structural engineer who she viewed as a stain on her perfect vista. "This shanty is officially condemned," she shrieked, the camera lens practically up my nose. "I am Patricia Vane, president of the Highland Ridge Homeowners Association, and you have exactly 5 minutes to vacate before I have this illegal eyesore bulldozed." Sterling choked on his coffee, actually sputtering, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin as he looked from me to the woman who had just interrupted a federal grant meeting with the wildest accusation imaginable. "Excuse me, madam," he started, but I cut him off, watching Patricia's minion, a nervous-looking kid in a polo shirt, start photographing my solar array. Patricia didn't know it yet, but she had just walked into a buzzsaw, declaring war on a grieving widower who was currently breaking bread with the man who could indict her entire bloodline. And honestly, if she had just done her homework, she would have known that I spent 3 decades building the backbone of this state's infrastructure before I retired to these woods. Let me rewind for a second, because to understand why a lunatic in Prado was screaming at me, you have to understand the ghosts that live in these walls. This cabin wasn't just wood and stone. It was the final resting place of a promise I made to Elena, my wife, who passed away 2 years ago from a glioblastoma that stole her mind piece by piece, but left her heart intact until the very end. On her last night, amidst the beep of morphine pumps and the smell of sterile despair, she squeezed my hand and made me swear to turn our 40 acres in Silver Creek into a sanctuary, a place where city kids could touch grass that wasn't plastic and see stars that weren't on a screen. That's why Sterling was here. He was fast-tracking my application to turn the old mining outpost into the Elena Thorne Wilderness Institute, a project that the governor himself was backing. But Patricia Vane, with her helmet hair and eyes that looked like shark glass, didn't care about dying wishes or education. She cared about property values and the visual pollution of my off-grid setup. She handed me a citation that smelled of cheap perfume and tyranny, demanding $20,000 in fines and the removal of my solar panels, claiming they violated the covenants of a neighborhood I didn't even belong to. "You are in violation of the community aesthetic guidelines," she sneered, looking at Sterling like he was a hired gardener. "And if you think having a guest over will save you, you're delusional." Sterling stood up then, and the transformation was instantaneous. Gone was the breakfast companion, replaced by the shark-like demeanor of a federal prosecutor witnessing a civil rights violation in 4K resolution. He slid a recorder into my hand, whispering, "Let her dig her own grave," before turning to face her. But Patricia, fueled by the absolute certainty of the ignorant, just laughed, telling him to get off HOA-controlled land before she had his car towed, not realizing she was threatening to tow a government vehicle. She eventually stormed off, tires spinning, leaving me with a citation and Sterling with a look of cold, calculated fury, promising me he'd look into her little empire. The next day, the harassment escalated from verbal assault to bureaucratic warfare when a beat-up county truck rattled up my driveway, looking like it was held together by duct tape and prayers, driven by Inspector Vance, a man who looked like he sweated purely out of guilt. He walked up the steps, clipboard trembling, avoiding eye contact as he told me he had received complaints about my electrical grid and was authorized to red tag my entire property, effectively shutting off my power and water. I looked through my binoculars and saw Patricia's black SUV idling at the tree line, watching like a vulture waiting for the carcass to cool. "This system is dangerous," Vance mumbled, sweat beading on his upper lip. "But, these things can go away. There are expedited processing fees, maybe $9,000 in cash, and I could forget I was ever here." It was a shakedown, plain and simple, a clumsy attempt at extortion that insulted my intelligence more than my wallet. I set down my mug, looked Vance dead in the eye, and asked him who he thought wrote the county's electrical safety protocols in 1995. He blinked, confused. "I don't know." I reached under the table and pulled out a leather-bound binder, thumping it onto the table, opening it to the original, stamped engineering schematics for the county grid, signed by me, Elias Thorne, chief engineer. I wrote the code. "Vance, I literally define the standards you are pretending to enforce, and my system here exceeds those standards by a factor of 10. So you have two choices. You can eat that red tag, or I can call the licensing board and explain why you're soliciting bribes to ignore safety codes." Vance turned a color that I've only seen on uncooked pastry, stammering apologies, backing away so fast he nearly tripped over his own boots, and within an hour, my phone buzzed with an encrypted text from Sterling. "Inspector Vance has a history of irregular audits. We're opening a file." But Patricia wasn't done, not even close, because bullies like her don't stop when they hit resistance. They just change tactics. That evening, my neighbor Old Man Silas, a 70-year-old Vietnam vet who distilled moonshine that could strip paint and fuel rockets, hobbled onto my porch with a mason jar and a conspiratorial grin. "The Duchess of Highland Ridge paid me a visit too," he wheezed, pouring a clear liquid into 2 tin cups, measuring my fence line, talking about eminent domain and water rights. Silas took a sip that would kill a horse and leaned in, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "But I got something she don't know about, Elias. I got my granddaddy's surveyor maps from 1892, and if my memory serves, her whole plastic palace is built on land that don't belong to no developer." We sat there as the sun dipped below the peaks, the sky turning a bruised purple, and I realized this wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a siege. A week later, I was teaching a small group of trial-run students about water filtration when a truck emblazoned with Vane Environmental Solutions pulled up, driven by a guy who looked like a clone of Patricia, wearing a hard hat that had never seen a construction site. This was Marco Vane, her nephew, claiming he had reports of groundwater toxicity and needed to test my well immediately. He dipped a test strip into a bucket, waited 3 seconds, and announced with theatrical gravity that my water was lethal and I needed to evacuate the children immediately, handing me a quote for a $30,000 septic overhaul. It was terrifying, effective, and completely fake. I knew it was fake because I had my water tested weekly by the state lab, but the parents didn't know that. The kids didn't know that. "Get off my land," I said quietly, but Marco smirked. "Health department is already on the way. Old man, you're finished." That was the moment I stopped playing defense. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number Sterling had given me, not for him, but for Agent Ripley of the EPA's regional office. "Put him on speaker," Ripley said, her voice cutting through the mountain air like a razor. "This is Special Agent Ripley, Federal EPA. If you do not vacate that property and surrender your fraudulent testing equipment, I will have U.S. Marshals there in 20 minutes to arrest you for impersonating a federal official and terrorizing a protected watershed." Marco froze, his smirk dissolving into panic, and he scrambled into his truck, peeling out of the driveway so fast he left skid marks on the pavement. The war had begun, and Patricia Vane had no idea she had just poked a bear that was protected by the United States government. The escalation didn't just climb, it skyrocketed, spiraling from petty neighborhood tyranny into a labyrinth of corruption that made my head spin. Following the humiliation of her nephew, Patricia Vane decided to go nuclear, and 2 days later, a courier served me with a cease and desist order from the Silver Creek Zoning Board, claiming my educational camp was an unlicensed commercial enterprise operating in a residential zone. The document was thick, legalistic, and terrifying, citing specific clauses from my federal grant application. Information that was supposed to be confidential, known only to me, the federal grant officer, and Attorney General Sterling. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. Someone had leaked my paperwork to Patricia, handing her the ammunition to strangle Elena's dream in its crib. I called Sterling, but his voicemail was full, a silence that felt heavy with implication. Desperate, I pulled an all-nighter that would have killed a younger man, filing emergency paperwork to incorporate the Elena Thorne Wilderness Institute as a federally recognized 501c3 nonprofit, a legal maneuver that technically placed me under federal jurisdiction, bypassing the local zoning clowns entirely. When I walked into that hearing the next morning, facing a panel of board members who wouldn't meet my eyes and Patricia, who was preening like a peacock in the front row, I dropped the incorporation papers on the desk like a grenade. Federal law supersedes county ordinance, I announced, watching the blood drain from Patricia's face. You can't zone restrict a federal education partner. It was a victory, but it felt hollow because the leak was still gnawing at me. That night, old man Silas showed up at my back door, looking like he'd seen a ghost, clutching a rusted metal lockbox that smelled of damp earth and history. I found it, he rasped, his hands shaking as he laid out documents that were so old they felt like fabric. It was a federal land patent signed by President Benjamin Harrison in 1892, designating the entire northern slope of the valley, the exact land where Highland Ridge and Patricia's mansion stood, as a permanent, non-transferable watershed conservation zone. It's stolen, Elias, Silas whispered, pointing to a forged deed transfer from 1974. My daddy kept these records. The developer, a man named Harrison Blackwood, bribed the county clerk to erase the federal designation. I looked closer at the signature of the county clerk who had facilitated this massive theft, and the world stopped spinning. The signature read Robert Sterling Sr., the father of the current Attorney General. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Sterling wasn't helping me out of the goodness of his heart. He was managing the situation, keeping me close to ensure I didn't stumble upon the family secret that built their political dynasty. I was the mouse thinking the cat was his bodyguard. I needed allies, people who weren't connected to the Sterling machine. I reached out to Dr. Juliana Hart, a rogue geologist who had been blacklisted by the state for finding arsenic in the local water table, and Attorney Kalin, a sharp-tongued litigator who had lost her family ranch to Patricia's HOA years ago. We met in the basement of Silas's cabin, a war room of misfits, joined by Lucas Redfeather, a tribal liaison whose ancestors had protected this valley for 1,000 years. This is RICO territory, Kalin said, her eyes scanning the documents. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy against rights, environmental crimes. If we can prove Sterling is protecting this legacy, he goes down too. But Sterling was ahead of us. My phone buzzed, a text from him. Need to see you. Urgent. Come alone to the office. 2 p.m. I wired myself up, taping a recorder to my chest, sweating through my shirt as I walked into the lion's den. Sterling's office was a monument to power, mahogany, and leather, and he greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He spread photos on the desk, high-resolution surveillance shots of my cabin, of Silas entering my house, of Dr. Hart taking soil samples. We have a problem, Elias, he said, his voice smooth as oil. These people you're associating with, they are radicals. They're compromising the federal investigation. You need to cut them loose. He was trying to isolate me, to strip away my support network so he could bury the evidence of his father's crimes. I played the confused old man, nodding, agreeing, while every instinct screamed at me to run. But the real horror was happening miles away. While Sterling kept me talking, my phone vibrated in my pocket, a frantic, repeated buzzing that meant emergency. I excused myself, stepping into the hallway to answer. It was Dr. Hart, screaming, Elias, get to the hospital. It's Silas. His house. The power went out, his oxygen concentrator failed, the backup battery was smashed. They tried to kill him, Elias. They tried to suffocate him. I drove to the hospital doing 90, tears blurring my vision, rage boiling in my gut. This wasn't about zoning or solar panels anymore. These monsters had attempted to murder a 79-year-old veteran to keep a land deed secret. Silas was in the ICU, a tube down his throat, looking frail and small, but his eyes were open, burning with a fire that demanded retribution. Kaylin met me in the waiting room, her face pale. "They raided my office," she whispered. "Took the files. They think they got everything." I looked at her, then at Silas through the glass, and then I touched the recorder still taped to my chest, feeling the hard plastic against my skin. "They didn't get everything," I said, my voice sounding strange, devoid of fear, replaced by a cold, metallic resolve. "Silas made copies. And I have Sterling on tape threatening me. We were cornered, battered, and bleeding, but we had the one thing they didn't expect, the truth, and the absolute willingness to burn their world to the ground to expose it." The final move of Patricia Vane's desperate endgame was a stroke of evil genius so profound it almost commanded respect. While Silas lay in that hospital bed, fighting for every breath, she filed an emergency petition with the probate court to have him declared mentally incompetent, citing paranoid delusions and dementia, aiming to appoint herself as his legal guardian under some obscure neighbor care statute. She brought in Dr. Abernathy, a psychiatrist with a smile like a used car salesman, who was ready to testify that Silas's claims about federal land fraud were merely symptoms of a decaying mind. If they succeeded, Silas's testimony, and the provenance of the 1892 maps, would be legally worthless. The hearing was scheduled to coincide with a massive press conference Sterling had called at the county courthouse, where everyone assumed he would announce the resolution of the HOA dispute, effectively sweeping the corruption under the rug while taking credit for brokering peace. We had one shot. Kaylin stormed into the hospital room just as Dr. Abernathy was beginning his sham evaluation, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals we had summoned using Lucas Redfeather's direct line to the Department of Justice's Tribal Crimes Division. "Dr. Abernathy," Kaylin announced, her voice ringing off the linoleum, "you are hereby served with a federal subpoena regarding 5 wire transfers of $10,000 each from the Highland Ridge HOA accounts into your personal offshore holding company." The blood drained from Abernathy's face so fast he looked like a corpse. The marshals didn't wait for an explanation. They cuffed him right there next to the bedpan, dragging him out as he stammered about attorney-client privilege. Patricia's medical hitman was neutralized, but the head of the snake was still standing at a podium downtown. I arrived at the courthouse steps just as Sterling was adjusting the microphone, the glare of news cameras flashing off his polished teeth. Patricia was there, sitting in the front row with her legal team, looking smug, expecting a pardon. I stood at the back, flanked by Lucas, Dr. Hart, and Kaylin, holding the original 1892 patent and the audio recording of Sterling threatening me. We were ready to storm the stage, to cause a scene that would end in arrests. But then, something impossible happened. Sterling looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning until they locked onto mine. He saw the folder in my hand. He saw the resolve. And in that split second, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected: resignation. He knew. He knew we had the evidence, and he knew his father's legacy was radioactive. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice wavering slightly before hardening into steel, "I came here today to announce a settlement. But I cannot do that." Patricia's smile faltered. "Over the last month," Sterling continued, "federal investigators, working with my office, have uncovered a systematic criminal enterprise operating within Highland Ridge. We have evidence of bribery, environmental terrorism, attempted murder, and—" He paused, looking down at his prepared speech, then crumpling it up, "and historical land fraud dating back to the 1970s, facilitated by county officials, including my own father, Robert Sterling Sr." The silence that descended on the plaza was absolute. You could hear the wind rustling the oak trees. Patricia stood up, mouth open, screaming, "This is a lie. This is a betrayal." "Furthermore," Sterling said, speaking over her, "I am recusing myself from this case immediately and handing all evidence to the FBI. Agents are executing arrest warrants as we speak." As if on cue, the doors behind the podium burst open. FBI agents in windbreakers swarmed the seating area. I watched, feeling a surreal sense of detachment, as Patricia Vane was wrestled to the ground, her Chanel suit scraping against the concrete, handcuffs snapping onto her wrists as she shrieked obscenities at the cameras. Inspector Vance was picked up trying to run toward the parking lot. Marco Vane was dragged out of a nearby Starbucks. It was a purge, a total, biblical cleansing of the rot that had infected our valley. Sterling walked off the stage, ignoring the shouting reporters, and walked straight up to me. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "My father was a crook," he said quietly. "I didn't want to believe it until I saw your evidence. I hope this makes it right." He walked away before I could answer, a man who had just torched his own life to save his soul. 6 months later, the Highland Ridge gates were gone. The federal courts had seized the land, dissolved the HOA, and ordered the restoration of the watershed. The victims of the scam were paid out from a $50 million restitution fund seized from the developers. Patricia got 15 years in federal prison, Marco got 5. I sat on my porch, the smell of coffee and pine once again filling the air, but this time, it was accompanied by the sound of laughter. 20 kids from the city were down by the creek, led by Dr. Hart and a fully recovered old man Silas, who was telling them wild stories about the Battle of Silver Creek. The solar panels gleamed in the sun, no longer illegal, but a beacon of the Elena Thorne Wilderness Institute. I looked at the wind chimes Elena had hung years ago, listening to their gentle music. We had won. The valley was safe. But as I watched Sterling's recusal interview on my tablet, seeing a man destroyed for doing the right thing too late, I couldn't help but wonder about the cost of truth. We teach our kids that justice is blind, that good always triumphs. But we rarely tell them that justice often requires a sacrifice so heavy it breaks the person holding the scales. Sterling saved us, but he had to destroy his family to do it. So I ask you this. If you found out your entire life, your wealth, and your family's legacy were built on a crime committed by your father, would you have the courage to burn it all down to save a stranger? Or would you have buried the evidence and let the old man on the mountain disappear? Let me know in the comments.